Okay, so I'm going to give you a little kind of a storied analogy here today. So let's imagine there's a flood, okay? And you can conveniently ignore the hundreds of ancient parables about floods. I'm going to throw one more on top of there. Maybe it'll be ancient one day. But let's imagine there's a flood, and as floods do, they drown people, right? So, being that we are kind of inventive human beings, we already kind of have some ways to circumvent the flood, right? So what do? Well, we have lifeboats, right? We invent lifeboats, and the lifeboats enable us to float on top of the water, so we don't die, so we don't drown. But let's say that there's only enough lifeboats for 90% of the population. What does that entail? Or what does that imply? Well, that implies that 10% of the population ain't going to make it. They're going to drown because they don't have a boat. But let's think a little deeper here. As you're waiting in line, let's say you're at the back of the line to get on the lifeboats, and you see that there's not enough lifeboats, right? You see that we're going to have a scarcity of lifeboats. So are you going to sit there and wait to drown, or are you going to do something else? Are you going to get up and you're going to fight for that lifeboat? The answer is pretty obvious, okay? When there is a scarcity of needs, and in this scenario, the need is the lifeboat, if there's a scarcity of that lifeboat, people are going to fight over the remaining lifeboats. And in that scuffle, some of the lifeboats get capsized, and they're floating down the river with nobody on them. So just like that, you thought you had enough lifeboats to save 90% of the population, and you actually only have enough to save 80%, because 1 out of 9 lifeboats is now floating down the river empty upside down. So let's say that the flood recedes, and 80% of the population is all that's left. The 80%, they beach onto the shore with their lifeboat as the flood recedes, right? And as the disaster kind of calms down, every individual, every survivor has a decision to make in the coming weeks. They can decide that they're going in the coming weeks. They're going to decide how they respond to the next flood, or how they prepare for the next flood. They're going to choose a proactive response in preparation for the next flood, right? So one thing they might do is they might say, well, in order to prepare for the next flood, I'm going to make sure I have a boat. So I'm going to go to the shore that we just beached on, and I'm going to grab a boat. I'm going to write my name on it. I'm going to create a government that validates my ownership of the boat to ensure that nobody else steals my boat, so that I have it the next time the flood comes around, right? Makes sense. So this overlooks that scuffle that occurred the last flood, though, right? So what if you claim ownership over a boat, you write your name on it, you got your Sharpie or your paint or whatever, you write your name on it, but let's say there's a scarcity of boats next time the flood comes around. Is your ownership going to guarantee you access to that boat just because it has your name written on it? Of course not, right? I'm pretty sure that the person who's drowning in the water next to you is not going to give a fuck whose name's written on the boat. It's not going to give a fuck about the government that validated the ownership of that boat, or that declared that ownership of the boat to you. That person drowning in the water is going to grab on your boat, and they're going to flip it, or they're going to get on it and sink it if there's too many people, right? So the point here is that you cannot solve a problem caused by a scarcity of needs by simply claiming ownership of a chunk of the scarce necessities, okay? You have to solve the scarcity, which means you have to ensure that everyone has access to a boat. So when you beach after that flood, the better decision to make, the better proactive response or proactive defense mechanism in preparation for the next flood, is to build boats and give them to everybody, so that everyone has them next time the flood comes around, right? To ensure that there is no longer a scarcity of boats. This is just an analogy, right? The boats can be food, the boats can be money, the boats can be anything that we need to acquire what we need to survive, right? So in today's economy, a lot of things are placed behind a paywall. Most things are placed behind a paywall. There's very little that you can acquire for free today without giving some money up, right? So if your solution to scarcity is to acquire money, and you're not paying, and you're collecting money, you're hoarding money, and that money is coming out of the pockets of somebody else who needs it to survive, and you're just choosing to defend yourself by acquiring needs from a scarce pool of needs. So long as the scarcity remains, you can't avoid the scuffle that occurs the next time there's a flood, right? So if your solution to a coming revolution or a coming apocalypse or whatever it may be, a coming famine, is to collect stuff, what you are doing inadvertently is contributing to the very scarcity that causes the next revolution. So greed as a defense mechanism is foolish. It doesn't make any sense. If you are collecting part of a scarce pool of resources, a scarce pool of necessities, to insulate yourself from the scarcity, and you are creating scarcity elsewhere, somewhere else, in somebody else's life, you are contributing to the very scarcity that creates the need for the excess, right? So let's choose that second proactive solution. Let's choose to address the scarcity problem rather than to pull from the scarce pool of necessities. If the scarcity remains, there is no avoiding the next flood. There is no saving yourself from the next flood with more lifeboats, right? Or with more money, or with more land, or with more houses. We think we are being financially wise by saving money and by acquiring all of these material goods. But in reality, the only thing that saves you during a revolution sustainably is avoiding the revolution altogether by avoiding the scarcity that caused the revolution. So we have a scarcity of rationality today. Fear blinds rationality. Fear is the thing that makes you believe greed is a valid defense mechanism, is a viable defense mechanism. But greed is the very thing that creates the need for the revolution, right? Scarcity in my life, if I solve the scarcity in my life by creating a scarcity in somebody else's life, we're cooked, right? They're going to make their problems my problems. They're going to capsize my boat, or they're going to kill me and take it, right? So the concept of ownership falls apart when the needs are scarce. Understand this pattern, because no amount of gold, no amount of money, I don't even think a bunker will save you, because when you're going out of that bunker, you're gonna have a scarcity of belonging. You're not gonna have anyone you're not gonna have any friends. You're gonna kill yourself because you're lonely, right? You're gonna have a scarcity of belonging. Like I said, you have to understand that believing or that responding to a fear of scarcity with greed is fundamentally irrational. The only rational solution is to create abundance of the things that are scarce. So thanks for watching.